Welcome to Bishop Barron Presents. I'm Jared Zimmer, the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. In this episode of Bishop Barron Presents, we've actually got a special guest, Mr. Dave Rubin, the author of this best-selling book, Don't Burn This Book. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and be sure to sit back, relax, and enjoy. All right, well, I'm really excited to have this conversation, and of course we're talking about Dave's new book, Don't Burn This Book. And Dave, I thought maybe to get started, it'd be really important to kind of define, in this book you talk about classical liberalism compared to kind of a modern idea of liberalism. Maybe the first question, and I'd like to hear from Bishop Barron on this too, but a definition, kind of a working definition of what we mean by liberalism.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say it's nice to be around real human beings. You know, our lives have been reduced to Zoom screens and Skype boxes and everything else, so it's good to actually be sitting with real humans communicating the way we did all the way back in early 2020 and before that.
Times.
You know, I obviously I get some version of this question a lot because I'm one of the people that sort of helped, I suppose, depending on which way you look at it, put classical liberalism back on the map. And I actually believe that classical liberalism is the political lens that most of us view the world through. In essence, you first believe in individual rights, meaning that if you're a legal member of any society, in our case, the American society, that regardless of your immutable characteristics, your skin color, your gender, et cetera, you should be treated equally under the law. This is the most basic thing. It's so fundamental to America and to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and everything the founders led to. It doesn't mean that we've always lived up to it perfectly. Of course, we had slavery, women couldn't vote. We can go into the litany of things that we didn't get right at one time that we have gotten right as time has gone on. But individual rights is the main thing. And then really laissez-faire economics, meaning you want the market to do most of everything. And then when I say that, well, people always say, well, how is that not libertarianism? And in essence, I would say the only thing that really sort of shifts a classical liberal from a libertarian is that I believe that there is some utility to government. I would describe it as almost an unpleasant or unnecessary need for government, where the pure libertarian aspect, you know, you're going to constantly be disassembling the state. And I like that. We've talked about it a bit, actually, when I've had Bishop Barron on. I like that intellectually, and I've had great conversations with anarchists on my show. I just don't think a society can truly function that way. So individual rights, laissez-faire economics, so the light touch of government, and then using logic and reason and Enlightenment values. And then what sits sort of beneath all of that is what our founders talked about, which is that we have God-given rights, meaning that the rights that we have did not come from us, because if man gave you those rights, well, then man can take them away, and man did not make me free. I was born free.
And Bishop, how would you maybe define?
How'd I do there?
Pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, I know, I'd affirm all of that. And it's a famously slippery term in some ways, liberalism. People characterize it in different ways. Martha Nussbaum, the great University of Chicago philosopher, simply said liberalism means the quest to find ever greater equality and liberty. So that's sort of the political definition. The rights, freedom, dignity of the individual, I'd say absolutely right. An opening up of a free space, both for commerce and for conversation, I think is part of liberalism. So, you know, freedom of speech and assembly and so on. But maybe Nussbaum has got the kind of tightest definition. It's the movement that's pushing for ever greater equality and liberty.
So would you say that, of course, now we're in this culture of what we might call a wokeism, right? And would you say that wokeism is a deviation or a descendant of liberalism? How would that work? That conversation's being had publicly. Where does that land?
Yeah, it's a great question, which actually gets us, we didn't sort of answer the second part of your first question, which is how is that different than the modern definition of liberal? Right. And that, I think, is much closer to when you say wokeism or progressivism or leftism or Marxism, whatever you want to call this thing that we now see that is obsessed with identity politics and judging us on these immutable characteristics, which, as I said, is so counter to the American way of viewing things. I would say that in a bizarre sense, and it's hard for me as an old school liberal to admit this, but I've come to this conclusion begrudgingly, that at the end of liberalism, you sort of end up with wokeism if liberalism only is to rely on the human mind. So if it's only to rely on Enlightenment values, that we can organize ourselves around what is logical and good, well then that will constantly be changing, and that everything that sits underneath society will constantly be up for debate. And that's in essence what wokeism is. So when right now you're not allowed to say that there are fundamental biological differences between male and females. Of course we know that's true. It's scientifically true. We're debating something that we all, 5 years ago, every rational person would have said that. Suddenly that's up for debate. And the reason for that is that once you remove something that is true outside of us, well, then you get this constant battle over feelings. And then if you're to say, well, I believe that there's a difference, a biological difference between males and females, what are they going to tell you? You're a transphobe. And without even getting too far into that, it's the subjectivity that has led us to this. And we live in a deeply subjective society, which I think has something to do with the limits of liberalism in and of itself, which again, I only say that very begrudgingly. I take no joy in it because I still think it's truly the best political lens to look at the world, but that doesn't mean it's perfect.
Put my philosopher's hat on for a second. I mean, behind the classical liberal view, you've got people like Locke and Hume and Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill. Behind wokeism, it seems to me you've got Marx and Nietzsche and Michel Foucault. So it's a very different philosophical framework. And I think, yes, a big part of that is relativism in regard to both intellectual value and moral value. If everything's relativized, and the only lens through which we see the world is oppressor-oppressed, which seems to be the lens, that's a reductionism that you don't find in classical liberalism and has wreaked some havoc. Now, your question, I think, is really intriguing one. Is it a betrayal of liberalism, wokeism, or is it a natural trajectory of liberalism? And I think as I read those who argue for the latter, it's something like this. If liberalism is the push for ever greater freedom from oppression, that when we handle one set of problems, we're going to have to invent some new ones for liberalism to keep alive. It's like when Marx says you have to find ever new markets because you've got to keep generating profit. So capitalism is always on the move for a Marxist. Well, I think as I read the argument, it's sort of applying that idea that liberalism can never be satisfied. It's always got to find new victims.
Well, that's what's so interesting about what's happening now, because by any stretch, if you live in America in 2020, regardless of your skin color or your gender or your sexuality, you are at the pinnacle of what people of all time would have thought of as a free individual. There is no law stopping you from doing anything as an American. It doesn't mean we're all born in the exact same socioeconomic state. It doesn't, some of us are lucky or some of us are unlucky. Sometimes you work harder for your luck. I mean, all of the things that make the magic of life, that's sort of on you and hopefully has something to do with your philosophical view of the world or your family, your parents, all of those things. But at some level, is it the extension, is it the natural extension of liberalism to end here? Well, if we got to equality, if we basically got to equality, which is where we're at, well, they don't want to leave good enough alone. That's what you're talking about, finding new markets. So it's now they have to trade in, oh, I'm oppressed and you're the oppressor. They have to trade in things that are becoming smaller and smaller issues, which also, by the way, is why they have to yell about them louder and louder, because people do, after a certain amount of time, realize how inconsequential they are, which is why all of these people constantly tell you how horrible America is, how terrible capitalism is, all of these things, but they never leave. Right, everyone still wants to come here. You know, the only people who leave America are billionaires who are getting out for tax purposes. That's the irony, and I think that. So I don't know that there's a perfect answer for the is it a natural extension question, because it's sort of that's we're left with the emotions of people to be attracted to thinking that they're oppressed. That's a weird piece of the human condition, I think.
Yeah.
This might get ahead of your game a bit, Chair, but what strikes me as interesting is the social protests of the 60s. Religious people were very involved in those, often in leadership positions, most famously Martin Luther King, but many of the leaders, John Lewis, who just died, I mean, a Christian minister, who were leading those great movements. Now, what's going on in the streets is, I don't know any religious figure who's taking a leadership position, and I think it's because they sense a real difference in philosophical assumption behind the two movements. So that's to stress really how different they are. And they're different, I do think, in relation to religion, which maybe we'll get to, but I think that's a way of naming the demarcation.
Do you think that maybe perhaps the trajectory, there's two aspects that I'm hearing here in regard to classical liberalism. There's equality and freedom. Those two things kind of seem to be some benchmarks there. And the idea of equality and freedom and kind of this woke culture has changed from equality of opportunity versus outcome, maybe freedom versus freedom without responsibility. Would that be maybe the kind of two marks of what we're saying about wokeism?
I'll let you take one first. I took the other two first. So go ahead.
I say a lot about freedom, actually, because I think autonomy is one of the great marks of classical liberalism. And you see it in the political order, you see it in the economic order. So the free market, et cetera, the free market of ideas. And there's a great value to that. I prefer it to any form of tyranny. On the other hand, autonomy as such is not the great religious ideal. We say something more like theonomy, or that God becomes the normative value in my life. So it's not so much the purely autonomous subject determining him or herself politically and economically. It's the subject in relation to a supreme value. So that's one of the standard religious critiques of liberalism, which I would hold to, that in so stressing autonomy, it opens up a kind of empty spiritual space where it's now autonomous individuals bouncing off of each other. Now, there's something valuable about that in certain areas of life, but if we're lacking a moral framework that was classically provided by religion, I would say that's one reason why we move toward wokeism, why liberalism, which used to be undergirded by a very strong religious and moral framework, when that gave way, I think then you end up with wokeism. And you get the Nietzschean worldview, where the only lens is oppressor oppressed, is will to power against someone else's will to power. So I think that's a key thing, is how you construe freedom.
Yeah.
On what I call a freedom for excellence view, which is the classical view, religion plays a key role. If freedom is a matter of indifference and it's my autonomous self that sets the tone, then religion doesn't play as central a role.
Well, I think there's interesting ways to frame this that I think can make it very human. So if you were to say to a young person, I look at you, you're 18 years old, you're white, you're fit, whatever it might be. I know that you're a Christian, let's say. Do you think that means I can deduce anything about you, really? Like, I can have some vague sense of who you are and what you are, but really I don't know what you think about anything. I don't really know that much into your belief system or how you behave or some of those things. And that no 18-year-old would want to be judged that way. Nobody walks around saying, boy, just if someone could just look at me, they would have the sum totality of everything I am. And this is the weird thing that's happened. We got to the end of equality, meaning we've given everyone equal rights in America. And then we got into this bizarre equity thing, which is now where you have the same people who were screaming that everyone should be themselves and we should be free and all that. And in my purview, that would be the correct idea for the most part. But now they're the same ones who now want racial quotas. I mean, we're here in California right now where the state is actually there are legislators literally trying to get the Civil Rights Act basically removed from our legal system so that we will have, okay, you're going to have X amount of black people, X amount of trans people, X amount of women. The idea of that, going from equality to equity, has caused us to believe in things, I know not us, but has caused many people to believe in things that we would have called bigotry 20 years ago. Oh, in your hiring practice, you say that we should have 4 black people and 5 Latinos.
Be dictated by law.
And now it'll be dictated by law. Yeah. By the way, the same things that we were passing, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was to get rid of these things, right? To get rid of the ideas of quotas, and that you would be hired based on your skill set. And so they've managed to flip everything upside down. And that's why so many people are so confused, because at the very base level, it sort of sounds right. We want more diversity. Right. That kind of sounds right. But when you really think about what that means, you realize, well, what you're doing is actually taking away the most human part of all of us.
And equality of outcome leads by a very short road to some kind of tyranny.
Tyranny and a lot of unqualified people getting jobs.
Did it strike you? It struck me that when it was applied to Hollywood, when they came out with the things about the Oscars, the movie has to have so many of a particular race or whatever. You know, how would you make The Godfather today? Or how would you make, name any classic film, The Maltese Falcon, if those are the requirements in place.
Bishop, not only how would you make it, but they put these rules in but they said it's not going to start until 2024. So these are so important rules
Right,
to get it all right, but we have to just get all that racist stuff out of the can, because we've got it in the can for the next couple of years. I mean, it's all just silliness. And we know, of course, if you were getting on a plane, if you were heart surgery, if you had to have heart surgery tomorrow, would you want the best doctor available, or would you say, actually, I want the best doctor who happens to be a Latina woman? It just you would sound crazy if the doctor came in and said, I'm the best in the biz. And, well, actually, I care more about these immutable characteristics, and whether you got into that college in a more easy fashion than somebody else, that's what I hold as important. And that's what I mean by anti-human. It's taking things that we know we all behave a certain way in our private lives, and somehow the public nature of how we deal with all these things is very different.
I still like the Martin Luther King ideal. I think it's still the great ideal. And that's equality of opportunity.
Of course.
And judged not by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. To me, that's still a beautiful ideal. And there's classical liberalism in conversation with religion. So, I mean, King's I Have a Dream speech to me is a masterpiece of how to weave together the best of classical liberalism and the biblical tradition. Because he sensed correctly, the best of liberalism comes out of the biblical assumptions. Where does equality come from? As you said, human rights. If we say the government gives them or the culture gives them, God help us, But God gives them. How are we equal, by the way, unless we're equal, as Jefferson said, as created equal? So King, to me, represents a high point in this. And that's getting compromised like mad. In fact, I invoke King a lot. I get attacked by the woke people as I'm invoking the greatest hero of American civil rights.
Well, that's why the people that are tearing down the monuments and tearing down the statues, whether they realize it or not, they're pawns in a much bigger game, but they will one day come for Martin Luther King statues as well, because what you just laid out there, that he did not want his children to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, that's actually the reverse of wokeism.
Yeah, right.
So for all the people that think, you can give these guys an inch, and okay, let them take down Robert E. Lee statues. I'm not even making a commentary on Robert E. Lee for the moment, but they take down statues of George Washington too now, and everything else. They take down statues of Abraham Lincoln. He freed the slaves. But once you give them an inch, they're going to keep moving, and then it will come to that day. It will come to the day where they will be standing in front of an MLK statue, and the impulse will be to take it down, and they will take it down, because what you laid out right there is completely the reverse of what wokeism is.
Yeah.
Dave, in your book, you bring up, and Bishop Barron, you're alluding to this in regard to kind of religion providing some kind of social fabric. And Dave, in your book, you talk about the unique kind of quality that biblical story provides. And to your point about understanding the human, right? Biblical story provides such a kind of unique fabric of what it means to be a human being. So do you think that perhaps like biblical story, religion, these things kind of provide some type of social stability that when wokeism came about, it eschewed all of that? Is that part of the process?
Yes, absolutely. And I would go a step further and say that, as you know, I've had many atheists, well-known atheists on my show, and many of them, I'm not going to call anyone out specifically at the moment, but many of them are now coming to this weird realization that in a time of wokeness, in a time of sort of societal destruction, their allies are all religious.
Yeah, sure.
Their allies are people like you. And if you would have said that to them 5 years ago, they'd say you're crazy. Right. And I also find myself in a bizarre, my political evolution, I find myself allied with people with perhaps some more conservative values or beliefs than I had, or maybe even have to some degree even now. But that's sort of where we're left. When I was on, I'm sure we're going to talk about it a little bit, when I was on tour with Jordan Peterson, and he obviously did these biblical lectures and would frame a lot of things through the Bible. One of the things that kept hitting me was, I'm constantly attacking big tech. I think big tech has now, in a sense, become God, and that's a real problem because it's just a group of people that have a tremendous amount of power. And Jordan would be telling these stories, and one night he was telling the story of David and Goliath. I'm Dave, but it's really David. And I thought, wow, if there's this story, this eternal story that has taught people the little guy can beat the big guy, well, maybe Dave can beat Google. That really, I'm not just saying it to be glib or just because of the name. It meant something to me that we know deep down the little guy can win, and that doesn't come from nothing. Yeah. And I think a lot of the Enlightenment value liberals who want to detach all of this from belief, they're really struggling right now. They're really struggling right now because they're realizing that it's their own side trying to take them down, while the believers are the ones that are welcoming them, even if they have serious different existential issues.
Go right back, that's exactly right, it seems to me. Go back to de Tocqueville, 1830s, right? This young Frenchman comes over to this country and surveys American democracy. And he's one of the most insightful commentators in the whole history of our country. He sees all the virtues of liberal democracy, but he also observes this thing will last and thrive only in the measure that it's filled up by the religious institutions with a keen sense of moral and spiritual value. That's 1830 something, he says that. It was right then, it's right now. And I've been tracing for a long time now the rise of the none, so-called, right? The N-O-N-E-S, those without religion. When I was a kid in the 1970s, 3% of America would have said I have no religion. So 97%. They weren't all practicing, they weren't all saints, but 97% of our country would have said, I'm religious. Now it's 26% claim the status of none. That's a remarkable cultural change. And I think has contributed to wokeism, because look at the younger folks. Under 30, it goes up to 40% of our country now says no religion. And you think, oh, it's liberation, they're getting rid of these old, habits. That's dangerous for our democracy. And I think that's what's happening with the woke business and we'll maybe get back to Jordan Peterson, but I think he was stepping into that vacuum in a way and beginning to speak religious values to people.
Well, by the way, if that hole was being filled by something sensible, meaning that if woke was, let's say, a truly sensible set of ideas, these people would be a lot happier. I mean, one of the hallmarks is actually the endless misery, because they place a primacy on misery, because they associate misery with being oppressed. So the second you step out of that and you say, wow, the world is what it is, and it can be tough, it can be good at times, there's joy, there's horror, there's good, there's bad, all of those things. Well, then you can be free, meaning that at that point you can say, okay, it's on me to hopefully figure out some way to pilfer a life that has some meaning to me, something like that. Versus you need the misery. When we see these videos or these young people that are out on the streets and they're burning everything down and they're destroying things and they're talking about the patriarch and they're talking about how evil capitalism while they're filming it on their iPhones and the series of ideas, and they're burning down the Target in their neighborhood that their neighbor works at.
Employs the people in the neighborhood.
Right. It's a series of it's just one crazy move to the next, as opposed to something that has meaning, and you have to figure out what that is. And my own view would be that there's more than one way to figure that out, but you have to have something that anchors you first. Otherwise, the perpetual what happened today. You're going to look around. Basically, you're going to look horizontally all the time. This is what my friend Peter Thiel told me. If you never look up, then if you never look vertically, you'll look horizontally all the time, meaning you'll only look at what is right here. You will only look at you'll wake up every morning, there'll be a current event, and it will dictate your day. And that's simply no way to look at the world. Well, it's no way to look at the world and be fulfilled in any way.
What's interesting, that what shaped our culture for most of its history, the Bible. Look at the Ten Commandments. So people say, well, sure, don't steal and don't kill and don't commit adultery and don't lie, and these great moral absolutes. But they're predicated upon the looking up, right? The first commandments are all about God. Your life is not about you. It's not simply your autonomous self that matters. It's that you honor one God. There's no gods besides me. The president's not God, the country's not God, the culture's not God, the military isn't God. Nothing is God except God. And then don't take his name in vain. And we think, oh, no, don't say, dirty words. But what the Bible would have meant by that, I think, is don't use the name of God for manipulative purposes. Like you can use it in some way to get what you want in an incantation. But we have our version of that. If you want God just becomes someone I can manipulate for my purposes. And then keep holy the Sabbath means don't let this thing be an abstraction. You have to instantiate it, that you're going to go to church on Sunday. That's the look up that our culture just had that allowed them then to look around and instantiate that through the rest of the commandments. Now, take all that out, and all you got left is the autonomous will asserting its power. God help us.
Well, and by the way, if I could just add one thing to that, I mean, if you look at our political situation over the last couple of years, we seem to treat these people, regardless of whether you're a conservative or a liberal or a Democrat or a Republican, we seem to treat our political leaders as if they're God, as if their purpose or their design is to solve all of our problems.
Yes, right.
These people can't solve our problems. No. I mean, I think they probably could if they would just go away. That might solve most of our problems. But in essence, we talk about them as if they are prophets or as if they're these fixers of our life. And they're not fixers of our life. They're people that I would say, unfortunately, have to have something to do with our lives because, as I said to the first question, we have to have some societal guardrails.
The Bible knew that. I mean, from the very beginning. In Genesis, when God creates all these different elements, and you got the stars and the planets and the earth itself and the mountains and the animals, they were all at different points in the ancient world worshipped as gods. Those were all considered gods. And the Bible's saying, no, 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 no. Don't turn something finite into the infinite. Only God is God. But that's the problem, is that God is kicked out. The God space does not go away. It gets filled by something or someone, inevitably. Now look at the great, fascist dictators or whatever. Even look at our, cultural mavens and pop stars and so on. Something fills the God space necessarily. The Bible was so clear that we get it. We know this happens, and it's really dangerous when it does. So, no, you're not God, you're not God, you're not God, you're not God. There's only one God. And you have to honor his name, and you have to instantiate that belief in your life. When that disappears, and if you got now over a quarter of our country saying, I'm not religious at all, that is not a minor problem for a democracy, precisely for a democracy, it seems to me. For a liberal democracy, that's a very serious problem.
It's interesting, the terms of meaning have come up and different opportunities of kind of signs and symbols of this kind of decline that's occurred.
Yeah.
But also, I want to stick on this phenomenon of Jordan Peterson, of really what he was causing in the culture. And I don't think it's coincidence that as he kind of had to disappear for many reasons, but we end up with what we've got now. And I know, of course, one of my favorite chapters in your book is actually the Find the Mentor chapter with your travels with Jordan. And so maybe extrapolate a little bit about that phenomenon.
Yeah, well, first off, I mean, I said to my producer, Michael, on the way here, he was asking me something about what it was like being on tour with Jordan. And in many ways, it feels like a dream to me. I mean, I spent a year and a half going literally all over the world. We did about 120 stops in about 20 countries, traveled all over the United States. I mean, it was breakneck speed constantly. And when I tell you that there genuinely wasn't a negative moment, I mean it. Now, that doesn't mean there were little travel hiccups, little bumps in the road along the way. But in terms of that, we felt like we were doing something important. And I'll make it very clear when I say he was doing 90% of it, obviously, and the people were there for him. And I was, doing some fun stuff at the beginning of shows and doing the Q&As at the end. But what I saw Jordan do is the thing that I think we all know we're supposed to do, but we just don't for some reason, which is he took his life's work through psychology and studying history and sociology, all the things that he's cared about, that he's become an unbelievable communicator of. He took all of those things. He wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life. He then toured the book in front of thousands and thousands of people, and every single night gave a different lecture about whatever was on his mind. When you do a book tour, usually they want you to talk about the book, right? The idea is we're going to sell some books. Jordan didn't even want them to sell books in the lobby. I mean, he just thought, there's thousands of people out there. I'm going to just go out and say what's on my mind. So I saw a different lecture every night. And I was on that adventure with him. And one of the things that I talk about in chapter 9 about finding a mentor is, he was an accidental mentor to me because, I think people think of a mentorship as if someone's going to come to your office one day and say, Bishop Barron, this is what I want in my life and I need someone who can map it for me, that's lived a life that I want to get to some of those things. With Jordan, I sort of jokingly said to him the day the tour was going to start, hey, I'd love to come warm up for you. And I really was kind of kidding. And he said, come on down. And we did it. And the agents were there. And then the next thing I knew, it was a year and a half later. So you can find a mentor in an accidental way. But it was also that it wasn't like we were sitting there having these lessons about how to go ahead. I just watched I watched the man's words and thoughts line up with his actions every night. And then I saw what that did to people in the crowd. And the amount of people that we met that were off drugs, that were bettering their relationships with their parents or their spouses, that had given up another addiction, that had gotten a better job, that went back to school. I mean, I could tell you stories that I could probably have you guys in tears, and they were real, and they often had Jordan in tears. And they were incredible. So I think the secret was that it was right in front of you. All he did was say what he believed bravely and fight as the mob came to him. And that was it. And to the latter part of your question, I totally agree that part of the chaos that we're seeing right now is that he did become a father figure or an uncle or some sort of positive authority figure for young people. And then his disappearance has left people without that. And I'm certainly not that. And I don't know how many great public people it would take to fill that hole. When you talk about a God-shaped hole, Jordan left a pretty big hole right there.
Yeah. I thought about him a lot, actually. I was telling Dave before we came on camera here that it was about maybe 2 years ago at a bishops' conference, so the National Bishops' Meeting. All the U.S. bishops are there. They asked me to give a brief presentation on the nuns, right? So who are they? Why are they leaving? All this. So I laid out the stats and why I thought it was happening. Then at the very end, I said, well, let me give you some signs of hope. And so I gave like 1, 2, 3. And number 4, I said, I'm not sure you even know this man's name, but there's this fellow, Jordan Peterson, who is giving talks around the country. And at that point, they were on the Bible. And I said, he's this psychology professor from Toronto. He's a massive presence online. And he gives serious lectures on the Bible. He's attracting thousands to his live shows and millions by online. So I just laid that out, you know. And the bishops, I think, were fine. Most of them probably didn't know who he was or had a vague idea. But then afterwards, there is a left-wing Catholic, you know, Twitterverse, and they just went after
There's
me.
every kind of Twitterverse.
Yeah, I mean, they went after me just for mentioning his name. And I was not endorsing really anything he said. I just said he's this sort of phenomenon that we should find some hope in. But that's one issue that the Catholic left. But what I find really fascinating is just that. Here's our book. I'm saying our now in a proprietary way, you know, as a bishop of the church. Here's the Bible. Here's the Bible. People have been leaving our churches in droves. We've obviously not been proclaiming this Bible in a way that a lot of young people are finding compelling. Yet here comes Jordan Peterson, who's speaking from the same book. And what he's doing, I would say, is what the church fathers did when they talked about the moral meaning of the Bible. So I don't want to bore you with all the details, but there are different levels of interpretation, one of which is the moral. So the Bible stories teach us how to live. And I think Jordan Peterson was doing exactly that. And they were responding in droves to him with extraordinary life-changing enthusiasm. That's partially a judgment on us. And I'm pointing to us religious people, that we weren't doing something with our great book that's really worth doing. Second observation is, he's addressing people who have left the churches and have lost the sense of a moral and spiritual ballast to an autonomous society. If all you're left with is autonomy, then you're in a very flat space. He was speaking to that, it seems to me, which is why he had, and you know, it sounds a little strange to say, but almost a messianic quality. Yeah. Well, I'm not entirely surprised by that, even though in many ways an unlikely candidate. I mean, he's not like a flashy, hey, look at me sort of speaker at all. But yet he did have that extraordinary impact on young people. It's a judgment on us. It's also a sign, I do think, of hope, you know, that when you speak spiritual truth into that space, people will respond.
Well, not only will they respond positively, obviously, by the thousands of people that bought, literally millions of people. I mean, I think over 6 million copies of the book were sold, but then the thousands of people that showed up. But then you're also going to get, in many ways, an equal or more severe backlash, which he got too, because of course, if you're going to tell the truth, you're going to get a lot of backlash. I'll tell you one very brief story about being on the road with Jordan, because it got cut from the book, and it truly moved me in an incredible way. We were in Dublin, and this is in the midst of bouncing around Europe, where there were just, you know, night after night, different country, and he's doing all the press, and yet still, as I told you right before we started, just never didn't give 100% on any given night. And it was a long day in Dublin. We had a great show, but we had just got in that day, traveled, the whole thing. He did the meet and greet. I mean, it's a grueling, intellectually and mentally and physically, it's tiring. As you guys know, when you do these theater shows, as the performer, you usually can't walk out the main entrance because there's a lot of people waiting. So there's usually a side entrance. That's a little insider trick for people that are trying to meet people after the show. We walk out of the show. It's probably 1 a.m. and we're in this little dark alley. And about 20 feet away, there's two men and they're hugging. And they start walking towards us. And one of them's probably about 60 years old. One of them's about 25 years old. And they're both sobbing, absolutely sobbing. They come up to us, and it's me and Jordan and the tour manager. And the older one says, this is my son, and we've been estranged for 5 years. We have not seen each other for 5 years. By coincidence, not coincidence, but they both came to the show because they had read the book and were getting their lives together, saw each other in the audience, and their hugging after that was them making amends with each other. And they told us the story as they were crying. Jordan began to tear up, I began to tear up, the tour manager began to tear up. And I thought, this thing that I'm standing in right now, like, this is it. This is real and powerful for all the reasons that you just described. And yet so many people would somehow say that this, whatever the message is that Jordan was sending, was negative. And that's probably for a much broader conversation about the media and everything else. But just seeing that level of something, a father and son, 5 years, and there they are because these ideas brought them together. It was incredible.
Wow.
I think another aspect of this is that he provided, and you mentioned in the book that moment, that kind of famous moment with Larry Elder, where he talks about fatherlessness. It's particularly, sadly, hitting the black community in particular, but it's also just hit the United States in whole. I mean, we're over 33% fatherlessness in the country, and it's just rapidly rising. And Jordan Peterson even filled kind of a fatherly role. So what is that fatherlessness of the country? How is that affecting this kind of woke reality that we're kind of in a post-liberal reality?
I think it's affecting the country in many ways. I think that the fact that right now it seems like we don't have many adults in the room, right? Any conversation that we have, whether it's a political debate or a debate about science now, or literally anything, just about what's relative or relevant in pop culture or anything, it seems like everything is constantly whittled down to destroying someone else and canceling someone else and everything else. So when we talk about missing a father, well, of course, there's the family element, and that's what Larry Elder and I discussed so intensely in that fateful interview. But I think at a broader sense, at a societal level, there aren't many people that you can look up to, many people that exist in the public sphere, where I think we did have that for a long time, and we don't have it anymore. Even, I mean, I can give you just like a very simple, and this isn't even quite the right example, but if you were to think back to Johnny Carson Tonight Show, regardless of whether you like Johnny Carson or not, most people kind of liked him. He was sort of apolitical. He was just thought of this nice man at the end of the day that could kind of calm everybody down and make a joke about himself. And then because it was before the internet, you know, millions and millions and millions of people could watch this. Well, now if you take the late night comics, they're all cut from the exact same political cloth, making the exact same jokes, making fun of the exact same people who happen to often be the exact people that you're talking to very specifically. And it's like, well, we've lost that. The way I would relate that to the father part is we've lost something. Nothing really feels wise in society anymore. Jordan felt wise. And I think people actually do want that. They want to feel that, oh, that's a person that I could be like. And how many of those people exist in the public realm right now? Very, very few.
He's, of course, he has a strong Jungian orientation. You know, the archetype of the wise old man, Yoda in the Star Wars, which is just a Jungian story, really, all those different archetypes, and that's one of them. And I think Jordan Peterson did play that role in some ways. He was the archetype of the wise old man for the culture. To your question, Jared, you know, one of the clearest indicators by all statistical studies of disaffiliation is when the father stops going to church. At the risk of sounding sexist, not that mom's involvement isn't important, but statistically, again and again, when dad believes and goes to church, the kids follow. When dad doesn't go to church and doesn't believe, the kids follow. So make of that what you want, but I think it's certainly true. So the loss of the father figure is hugely important for religion.
Well, now I'd like to kind of switch gears a little bit. And in both your book, Dave, Don't Burn This Book, as well as Bishop Barron's Arguing Religion, you both talk about the necessity of good public debate. That's how a good classically liberal society operates. John Henry Newman called it the marketplace of ideas, the ability to kind of toss around ideas and that the truth will rise. But at the same time, there's kind of this call for tolerance. There's this call for, of course, I think we would all agree that there's a difference between people and ideas. But what are some of those kind of hallmark aspects of good public debate?
You don't always have to win, and you don't always have to be right. And I don't know, people will say to me, well, Dave, how do you sit across from some of these people when it's so obvious that they have ideas that are counter to yours? And I think, well, I think partly it's nature versus nurture. I think my general disposition of birth is that I'm wired a little cooler. Some people run really hot, some people run really cool, right? And that can be judged accordingly. I think that's partly. But I also grew up in a family where I talk about this in the book, where we debated everything. Every holiday was everyone arguing about foreign policy, about abortion, about religion, about everything. And then, quite literally, it happened every time. Dessert would be served, and then everyone just put it aside. That isn't to say we didn't have family issues about inner personal family stuff, but in terms of the public stuff, it was like, let's have that fight and let it go. I didn't even really realize until I was writing the book that had that imprint on me, because when you're writing a book, this, you have to really, well, why do I really think about this? It's not just some intellectual exercise, it's really, it's personal and it's real. So I think that is part of it, that we have to learn that we don't always have to win. But I think another part of it is, and I hit this also in the book, is that when I was a lefty, one of the things that I started realizing was so wrong with modern leftism is that everyone who disagreed with them was a homophobe and a racist and a bigot and the rest of it and a Nazi. And what I started realizing was that, beyond the absurdity of it, right, to call people in America in 2020 Nazis, I mean, it's so patently absurd. But it wasn't what you were doing to those people, it was what you were doing to yourself. Because if you run around calling everyone a bigot and a Nazi and these irredeemable phrases, well, what happens, and I think Trump has been a version of this, when they don't turn out to be that, for whatever flaws Trump has, when you don't turn out to be, you can't suddenly turn around and say, that Hitler guy I've been screaming about, he's actually not that bad, right? So what you've done is you've painted yourself into an intellectual corner that keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter. You give yourself no room to say, I was wrong. And by the way, that sort of also gets back to our earlier part about what society without belief leads to, because there's no forgiveness. You can't even forgive yourself at that point. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that if you can try to be a little better than your intellectual opponents, I think A, you'll find it not that hard to do usually, but B, there is a reward. It just takes a little longer to get there, because yes, it's, in a world of Twitter, do you want to just crush that person and own that person and get the viral video and all of those things? Yeah, you can do that, but I think there's a longer game out there.
Yeah, there's so much to say, Jared, about that. I always go back to Stanley Hauerwas. He's a Methodist theologian, one of my favorites. He said, the great challenge of our time is to discover how to have a good argument about religion in public. And his point was, we have these two, the binary option, either tyrannical imposition of one's views or bland toleration of everything. And in between those two, there's this lovely space called the space of argument. I'm not trying to impose something on you aggressively. I'm not taking advantage of my power and all that. Nor am I just saying, oh, well, I have this, you have that, let's tolerate each other. I'm trying to propose something to you that I think is true and that I think you'll benefit from hearing. That's called the space of argument. But see, people don't even know how to have an argument anymore, because what you said, they simply conflate ideas and persons. So if you have an idea that I don't share, you're a terrible person, I hate you, and I want to cancel you. As opposed to, no, why don't we discuss it? Which means pay attention. Think of Lonergan's imperatives, be attentive. What's real? What's real? What are the data? What's actually out there? Be attentive. Be intelligent. Marshal arguments. Try to get some evidence, Stop contradicting yourself. Stop doing ad hominem arguments. Be reasonable. Draw conclusions. I mean, it's not that complicated. But we've almost forgotten the art of having an argument. I can tell you on YouTube and Twitter and all that, no one ever argues. They don't know how to argue anymore. And I love argument. People say, oh, to argue is so negative. It's not negative at all. It's a path of peace. That's the whole point.
Well, look, you can either argue verbally or it ends up violent. I mean,
right. It's a way of holding off violence.
Yeah.
And my hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, Middle Ages, in dialogue with, literally in dialogue with people that would come to his, they call them disputed questions, where people would ask a question from the crowd and he'd have to answer it, you know. But in his writings, in dialogue with Jewish rabbis and Islamic scholars and with pagan scientists and with Christian heretics, and Thomas talked to everybody, raised a whole range of questions, entertained the objections seriously. In fact, it was in one of those Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates that I first heard the term steel man. I'd never heard that before. I mean, straw man.
Yeah.
But that's a really good exercise. Steel man your opponent's argument. Well, Aquinas does that naturally. When he lays out the objections to his own position, he does it in a really respectful and substantive way. That's a great art to develop. Steel man your opponent's argument.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Now remember, this is only a portion of a larger conversation, and in order to get the rest, you have to join the Word on Fire Institute and become a member. So all you've got to do is visit wordonfire.institute, and you can sign up, join us, and we hope to see you inside. God bless.
Could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. There are two terms I want to talk about that I think are both extremely dysfunctional and get us nowhere, but boy, are they popular in the commentariat. The first one is culture warrior, and the second one is divisive. Now, culture warrior, I think, is especially a stupid and unilluminating term, and here's why. It's used almost exclusively by people on the left to excoriate people on the right. So if you're on the right and you're opposed to abortion on demand, you're opposed to gay marriage, you're in support of religious liberty, that sort of thing, well, then you're excoriated as a culture warrior. You're a rock'em sock'em over and against kind of person. Well, I always smile when I read that because, I mean, the left, are you kidding? The left is just as much a culture warrior as the right. I mean, the left stands in favor of certain things in the culture, but the left is, gosh, radically against racism, against xenophobia, against homophobia, against environmental pollution. The left stands in a warlike attitude against all sorts of things in the culture. My point here is it's a term that gets us nowhere. It doesn't advance the argument in any way. It's simply a way of branding your opponent as a bad guy and signaling, I guess, your own virtue that, oh, you stand above the fray. You're not a warrior. You're a person of peace. I mean, give me a break. Everybody, no matter what position you take, you're against something in the culture. And I think here, too, heroes of the left, heroes of mine, too, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day. I mean, culture warrior, you bet they were. Now, both of them advocated nonviolent ways of engaging the culture, but King stood as a mighty warrior against racism, against segregation, against the degradation of his own people and of minorities, and did so in a very confrontational way, not violently, but in a very confrontational way. Same with Dorothy Day. Talk about a hero of nonviolence, to be sure, but boy, did she take on racism and militarism and the violence of our culture. My point is, they're as much culture warriors as anybody on the right. And so again, my point is, the use of that term gets us nowhere. It applies just as much to the one who's using it pejoratively as anybody else. And so the desideratum here is not to stay at that level of essentially name calling. We haven't gone much beyond the 6th grade playground when we're using terms like culture warrior to excoriate our opponents. Far, far better would be a return to real argument. Why don't we talk about these particular issues? So what about abortion? What about militarism? What about violence in our culture? What about, now take your pick, whether it's excoriated by left or right, let's talk about the issue and not stay at the level of essentially name calling. And that leads me to the second term, which I think is also comically ineffectual, let's say, in the public conversation. And that term is divisive. So invariably, people will say of their opponents, oh, he's being divisive. How divisive of you? Well, look, there is a morally bad form of divisiveness. If it's born of hatred, if it's born of a desire to harm somebody, I've said many times that one of the devil's names, diabolos, means the scatterer. I mean, so if you really are in that attitude of hatred and violence trying to divide people, that's always a bad thing, quite right. But here's my point. Anytime you make a real argument, anytime you make a real intellectual judgment, you are ipso facto divisive. And I'll show that now with the help of Bernard Lonergan, the great Jesuit philosopher. So Lonergan said, the 4 great imperatives that should animate anyone seeking truth. First of all is to be attentive. So see what's going on. What are the data? Be attentive. Secondly, be intelligent, by which he meant form hypotheses, have bright ideas, come up with all kinds of interesting possible explanations for a given set of data. So think of a scientist, hypothesizing. Think of a philosopher looking at different patterns of meaning. Okay. But, says Lonergan, the third step in the process, beyond be intelligent, is be reasonable. And to be reasonable is to make a judgment, is to say, okay, of all these bright ideas, they're all interesting and intriguing, but there's one that's the right idea. There's one that's at least the relatively adequate explanation. So a scientist will do experiments to determine which of his bright hypotheses is in fact the right hypothesis. So a philosopher, having looked at a variety of patterns, will say, but I think that's the best way to explain a phenomenon. Here's the point. Anytime you make that move, you decide. And the word decide is from a Latin root, close to scissors, by the way, that means to cut. To cut. When you say, yeah, that's the right answer, you have necessarily cut off all the other hypotheses. You've said, I think those are inadequate. You've decided, you've made a judgment. And therefore, everybody, ipso facto, you have become divisive, because people who hold the other hypotheses are going to feel, well, I guess he doesn't like me. I guess he's decided against me. Well, yeah, at least he's decided against your proposal. Anytime you make a judgment, which is an advance in the direction of the truth, you are divisive. And now Lonergan's fourth imperative is to be responsible. That means to accept the implications of the judgment you've made. If you say, yeah, this is the right decision, this is the right hypothesis, this is the right pattern of meaning, well, now accept that. Live up to it. And one way you live up to it, Lonergan thought, was to put up with people who are now going to start criticizing you. So if the minute you make a judgment and then you get criticism, you cave in, well, then you're not being responsible. So again, if you really have moved beyond the level of mere intelligence, you've come to real judgment and responsibility, you are ipso facto going to be divisive. Now, it doesn't mean the hateful kind of division. That's always bad. But this is a legitimate, inevitable type of divisiveness if you're really being intellectually responsible. Which is why very often in the commentary, when the term is thrown around, oh, what a divisive person. Oh, you're being so divisive. Well, yeah, if by that you mean I've made a real judgment, I've taken a real position, and I'm sticking with it responsibly. Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's an inevitable consequence of being intellectually responsible. So, could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. They get us stuck at the level of basically name calling. What's always the desideratum is the return to argument. The return to argument. Make your case. Make your judgment. Try to convince your opponent. But getting stuck at this level of essentially name calling, it's a waste of time. Thanks so much for watching. Peace be with you. Friends, we come to this first Sunday of Advent, to the liturgical new year. And, you know, I've said this before, but Advent's a time to get back to basics. Like a athlete returning, you know, to the, kind of the basic training. Some of the most fundamental truths of our faith are on display in these readings. And so once again, it's good for us to enter into that space. Can I suggest to you, we start with that familiar Advent hymn. We're going to be singing it now for the next 4 weeks all over the Catholic world. It's an ancient hymn, by the way. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. See, until we get into the spiritual space opened up by that hymn, we are not understanding Advent, and more to it, we are not understanding Christianity. So again, listen. O come, Emmanuel. It's a cri de coeur, as the French say, right? It's this cry of the heart, asking Emmanuel, God with us, to come. You see the clear implication? Is that whatever problem we have here, it's not one that we can solve. We're beggars. We're asking Emmanuel, come, and do what? And ransom captive Israel. Now, people being captured and held for ransom, that was a common experience in the biblical world. People would travel, sometimes long distances, and there'd be thieves and robbers and kidnappers who would take them to their distant country and hold them for ransom. Now imagine that situation before, communication and all of that. You've been captured, you've been taken to a distant land, and now you're being in chains, you're held captive. What can you do to save yourself? Nothing, except to cry out, come, someone to save me. Maybe they've sent a message way back to your city or your country asking for ransom. All you can do is beg and hope. Captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here. See, think of someone held for ransom. They're exiled. This very exactly describes the spiritual space we are all in. You want to know what the enemy of Christianity is? It's the view that, yeah, I've got problems, sure, but I can solve them, with enough psychological insight, with enough virtuous practice, with enough social reform. If we just straighten out the political situation, make the economy better, whatever it is, I can save myself from my dilemma. That's an ancient heresy called Pelagianism, by the way. And like most ancient heresies, Gnosticism comes to mind, which is massively on display today. Pelagianism is alive and well. Everyone admits they got problems. I don't know anyone who thinks he or she is living in complete utopia. But a lot of people up and down the ages, till the present day, think, I can solve it. I can deal with this myself somehow. That view, and St. Augustine saw this, it was one of his signal accomplishments. That view is the enemy of a salvation religion like Christianity. The assumption behind Christianity is the dilemma that we're in, the problem we're in, is not one that we can solve. Rather, we need grace. We need a power to come from outside of our dysfunction to set it right. You know, Kierkegaard, the great Protestant philosopher, got this right when he said, Christians don't look for a teacher. You know, all kinds of people look for a teacher. Oh, a teacher that will teach me some great spiritual truths, will straighten me out psychologically, and then I'll be okay. No. Christians don't look for a teacher primarily. They look for a savior. They look for a savior. Oh, come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. I can't save myself or ransom myself. Now, can I suggest to you, ransom and all that is the image the Bible uses. But I think one that we can get our minds around very easily is addiction. Many of us are familiar with the phenomenon of addiction. When you're addicted to, whether it's alcohol or it's to drugs or it's to sex or pornography or to power, think of all forms of sin are really forms of addiction. When you're caught in addiction, what can't you do? You can't save yourself from it, right? Think of the 12-step programs. Many listening to me have been through those or know someone who has. The key move in all the 12-step programs is to admit your powerlessness and to turn your life over to a higher power. Right. That's born of Christianity, everybody. That insight. That's born of Christianity. That's an anti-Pelagian insight. If you say, look, I'm powerless over this addiction, and the more I try through my own efforts to make it right, the worse I'm going to make it. No, oh come, Emmanuel. Turn your life over to a higher power. Only in that way are you going to be saved. Can I share another image with you? And I just, a few weeks ago, as I record these words, I was at a conference and Father Mike Schmitz was speaking as well. And he used this image I thought was really good. It's to this point. He said, imagine a young kid growing up in a family that's like deeply dysfunctional. Across the street, there's a family. Mom and dad are there. There's laughter coming from the house and on the front yard that the kids are playing sports with each other and with their parents. In the midst of his deep unhappiness, he looks across the street to this very happy family and longs that he might be part of that family. Well, then one fine day, the father knocks on the door of this kid's house. He opens the door and there's the father of this beautiful family who says, do you want to come live with us? That's an image, if you want, for what redemption or salvation is like. See, we human beings are in a dysfunctional family. This is exactly what the doctrine of original sin teaches, by the way. Sin affects all of us like a poisonous atmosphere. So there's the particular sins that we commit, that's true. But see, original sin names this environment of sin that's been there from the beginning of the human race and that conditions us, infects our minds and our wills and yes, even our bodies, willy-nilly. But we're not in control of that. It's like we're born into this dysfunctional family. Oh, come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. I can't ethically operate my way out of a dysfunctional family. No, someone's got to come. Some grace has to come from without and invite me to share a higher and a better life. See, to get this principle, everybody, is to get Christianity. And Advent is the season where we're meant to get in touch with our dysfunction, our deep need for grace. See, only then are we ready for the coming of Christ. See, as long as I can save myself, Well, oh yeah, Jesus, what a great, ethical figure from long ago and a, exemplar of a good life and someone I admire. Well, then Christmas turns rapidly into the silly, superficial foo-foo that we have in our society of Santa Claus and, presents and la-di-da. But see, Christianity, Christmas is all about a captive people unable to save themselves who are longing for the coming of the Savior. See, until we get into that space, we're not going to get it. Now, let me share a couple things from the readings for this weekend, which are on this point. Here's from the prophet Isaiah, which is our first reading. Behold, he's speaking to the Lord, you are angry and we're sinful. All of us have become like unclean people. All our good deeds are like polluted rags. We have all withered like leaves. Our guilt carries us away like the wind. You say, oh, what a pessimistic view. That's not pessimistic. That is the realistic view of someone who's living inside of a dysfunctional family. And it doesn't mean that there's nothing good at all going on within the human reality. That's not the case. But he knows in his bones he can't save himself. That even the best of his actions are affected by sin. And so he cries out. Listen to this now from the same passage of Isaiah. There is none who calls upon your name, O Lord, who rouses himself to cling to you. Now that's a good Advent attitude. What can we do during this time? Call out his name. Help me. Save me. Emmanuel, come. I can't do this myself. Now, with that in mind, listen to Paul. See, St. Paul got everything I'm talking about today in his bones. It's the heart of his teaching. Listen to Paul as he addresses the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Charis is Paul's word, grace. Christianity is not a religion of karma, not a religion of self-promotion or accomplishment. It's not a Pelagian project. Christianity is a religion of grace. Free gift. See, what Paul is saying is this grace that we need and that we long for has come to us in Christ Jesus our Lord. Open yourself to him. Surrender to him. Accept him. He's the free gift of grace to sinners. He's like that father knocking on the door of the kid in the dysfunctional family and saying, do you want to come live with us? Grace and peace. Listen to Paul now as he unfolds this teaching. I give thanks to my God always on your account for the grace of God bestowed on you in Christ Jesus, that in him you were enriched in every way. It's not the riches of my moral accomplishment. I try to work my way out of dysfunction. It's not going to work. But I've been graced by Christ and thereby enriched in every way. Now, one more quote here to tell you what this looks like and feels like concretely. God is faithful, and by him you were called into fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. So you say, okay, I guess I get it. We're caught in a dysfunctional family. We're in an addiction. We can't save ourselves. We can't lift ourselves out of it. We got to say, come, oh, come, Emmanuel. All right, I get. And then the claim is that the grace has come. All right, so now what do I do? Here's my answer, everybody. It's based on, 40 some years of studying Christianity and trying to live the Christian life. Here's the answer. Go where he is and stay there. Wait. So I'm messed up. My life's not going well. So the answer isn't like deeper psychological insight. I mean, it's fine. That's fine if you can get it. The answer isn't greater moral accomplishment. I mean, it's fine. And we can get there. The answer is Go where he is. Accept him. Listen again. Move into fellowship with his son. Okay, now we're in a Christian space. The grace of Christ has come. The word's gone out. Enter into that space. And you're going to find, listen to me now, you're going to find your whole life now transformed. Not through your efforts, but by your fellowship with him. May that same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, Paul says. He also says, it's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. Go where he is and stay with him. And you will find now your whole life revolutionized. You will begin to burn with that same fire that's in him. That's called the fire of the Holy Spirit, by the way. What's Advent? It's just this time of the realization of our captivity. That's very important. See, if you think there's something just superficially wrong with your life, you're not going to get Christmas at all. It'll become la-la, foo-foo. You have to get in touch with your dysfunction and your incapacity to save yourself. And then from the depth of your being, you can say, come, come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. Fall in love with Christ, stay in love with Christ, find fellowship with him.